All right, welcome back. We are in Unit 2, lesson number 7 on crossing cultural barriers. I'm Megan Westra. I'm an author and a high school teacher based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I am here with...
I'm Benjamin Bixler. I am a PhD student at Drew Theological School in Biblical Studies, and then also a high school teacher at Eastern Mennonite School located here in Harrisonburg, Virginia.
Cool. So today we are going to be looking, like I said, lesson 7, crossing cultural barriers. This lesson orients us in Acts chapter 11. Really, you need to do 10 and 11 a little bit together. And so kind of looking at Peter explaining in the chapter that the lesson is based on, explaining this vision that he had, kind of explaining his actions. He's just done something really just like offensive and unexpected in eating with Gentiles, with uncircumcised people. And so he explains himself to those who are interrogating him with this recounting of a vision that he had, where he sees this sheep being lowered down and being invited to take and eat from these unclean animals that were on the sheet. And so kind of coming to this question then of what boundaries are we being invited to cross? For Peter, this is a really big one. And I don't know if we can fully understand as Gentiles, as the people who are on the other side of this equation. I don't know if we can really understand how deeply shocking, offensive, surprising this would have been in that context. And I try to sit with, when I read passages like this, I try to sit with my body, and where in my body do I feel revulsion or feel this shock or this and in what circumstances do I, because that's what's happening here. That's where this group of people that's interrogating Peter, anybody he would have told this story to, any Jewish people he would have told this story to, that's going to be their reaction. It's just you did what? And so trying to sit when I read texts like this and even think about where do I feel that in my body? How do I, because that's a physical reaction. It's not just an emotional or a mental, oh, that's weird. Why did you do and so to kind of bring myself into those moments of when have I had this physical response of whoa, what? Because that is both how Peter reacted in the vision that he had, where God is inviting him to take and kill and eat these unclean animals. And I do feel we flattened the Greek out a lot. We translate that particular passage where it's just no, Lord, surely I will not. It's I don't think that was the inflection on those words. But it was a much stronger, whoa, no, absolutely not, no way. And so to try to feel in my body and remember in my body what that feels like, to bring myself to a more proper orientation to this text, instead of reading it as this really flat, well, why did you choose to do this? Why did you eat with those people?
Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely you're right that, this isn't something that Peter's just sort of has a mild reaction to. So he has this vision, he believes that it's God speaking, and then actually argues back with God 3 different times.
I love that. I love it.
It's just wait, so you knew it was the Lord, and yet you're saying, no, you can't be right because of all of these things that I've been taught, that I've grown up with. So the ways in which everything that Peter understands causes him to actually say, no, God, you can't be right because I know what I'm supposed to be doing because I've always done it this way. To me, that's the convicting part of this passage. Where are those places in my life? I don't think about it in the same way that you do with that bodily, visceral reaction, but what are those things that I'm so assured of that if God were to tell me something different, that I would start arguing about it? What is that thing for me? And I don't know that I've come up with an answer yet, but whatever you hold most sacred here seems to be the thing that Peter's being asked to give up. And so, yeah, so like it comes out in this idea of like eating kosher food, but even larger than that, it's specifically associating with these people who do that. And so there's this whole thing of he has to move outside of this, as a Hebrew Bible scholar, like this entire trajectory of people who are not a part of us, like are not to be a part of us. At least, there's one tradition, one thread that would trace that, whether it's the Moabites or the Ammonites or the Edomites, whoever it is, like you're just not supposed to associate. Like Ezra and Nehemiah are very clear, like you don't marry people from these other places. The book of Ruth and the book of Jonah maybe pushes back on that in some ways. So like there's definitely that dialogue going on, but Peter seems to be sitting in that group that says, no, we don't do this with these people at all, ever. And so he knows who the good people are and the bad people are, so much so that he's going to argue with God about it when God has a different message for him. So yeah, so that was the one thing that really kind of sat with me. You have to sort of go back and look at that whole trajectory of what Peter's carrying with him from his tradition about who's good and who's bad in this whole process.
So go read the whole Hebrew Bible and then chapter 10. And
yeah.
No, I love that Peter argues with God, mostly because I need that witness in my life, because I am solidly that person too, who is just like, I don't know. I don't think so. And so I find both the conviction in that and the comfort in that, that God gives Peter the opportunity to argue with God 3 times, right? That God's not like, oh my gosh, this guy again. God entertains the argument, right? And just keeps coming back with the message. And so I find the comfort in that too. I think I resonate a little bit more with what that might feel like, because I grew up in a tradition that didn't affirm women in ministry. And then I was called to ministry, which was real weird. And so having that moment, and I could like pull out my, if I went down to the basement and pulled out my like box of ancient journals from, when I was in high school and college, like I could pull out the pages of my journals and show you, like, I'm arguing with God here. Like, this is really weird. Like, I feel like you're calling me to ministry. Also, I don't know if you know this, Lord, but I'm a girl. And that's not allowed. And so I've kind of had that moment in my personal life, but I've had that moment a few other times where I've shifted my theology, shifted my praxis from this like very closed, very limited way of how God moves and works in the world and who God moves and works through to a much more expansive understanding of that. And it's really disruptive.
Absolutely.
And not just personally, but it's disruptive to those around you. And I think that may be the harder bit of it than like choosing it for yourself. I think it's the social cost of that too, right? That when I started to change my perspectives on some of these things, because God was, like lowering the sheet, as it were.
Yeah.
That there was a social cost to that there were people in my life who no longer were interested in associating with me in the same way. There were people in my life who outright were like, I'm really worried about you. This seems like really concerning, which is a little bit like where we're picking up in Acts in this lesson, is people kind of pulling Peter in and being like, what is going on? Like, just like, what is it? And so I think sometimes we put, again, as I feel like this is a thread that's run through the last few lessons of this like hyper individualism, and we tend to do okay when we think about our story, or like what I need or my community. But then when we start to consider the broader social, it gets a little more dicey, because that's a more atrophied practice for us.
It is.
And I think that we can shift our personal theologies or our personal understandings of who God is working through, who God is accepting and affirming of. But then we're hesitant to speak that out loud or try to enshrine that in policies or be really upfront about it, because that has a social cost. And if you have an experience of being privileged in a certain way, then that social cost can be terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for sure, like you said, this is sort of the moment we step into. So like we, in chapter 10, like we get Peter's actual vision, then we get his actual encounter with Cornelius. Then in chapter 11, we're picking up him before this council who, I mean, we're not at the Jerusalem council yet, but like it's this group of elders who are saying like, we don't do these things. So if you're doing this, you're no longer a part of us anymore. So there's definitely these stakes are at play here. Even for this person, Peter, who's been like, at the right hand of Jesus, like it's Peter, like Peter's like at the top, and he's being asked to sort of give up some of these comforts and these privileges and be a voice to speak for a more inclusive way of being. And so, yeah, I definitely see that too, that like, there's definitely the social costs that come with having these new visions. But at the same time, then like, you get this assurance in chapter 15 that where he's telling, or sorry, verse 15, he's telling this narrative about what happens with Cornelius. And we get this narrative account that like, and the Spirit showed up just like the Spirit showed up at Pentecost. And so it's not like Peter has any doubts once he's actually gone through this experience and met this person who he would have previously marginalized, and says, oh, the Spirit can be present in all of this too. And that's sort of what motivates him then to go on and sort of make this proclamation to the rest of the group and say, well, this is where I need to be headed because I know the Spirit's involved in this. And so that's what was really encouraging to me, is that the Spirit shows up when Peter lives into this calling that he has to be more inclusive, to be more open, and to sort of get rid of some of that, well, I don't do this with these people over here. The Spirit actually shows up then.
Yeah, and I would love for us to just, like, so many good things happen when that's how we orient, right? Mm-hmm. When we ask the question, not, well, what are their like statements of belief, right? But like, is the Spirit here? Yeah. Like, is the Spirit here? And I think that, with websites and like all the different ways, if I think about like, how do people find different churches or different congregations to worship with, like so often you're going online, you're looking, you're seeing, like, do they check these boxes? What do they say about this? Do they have programs for my kids, right? Like, it's like all this like information stuff and very little like, let's just show up and find out if the Spirit's there, which is like very woo woo and very hard to like quantify. Again, I'm just like going back to like, do you feel it in your body? Like, do you feel like the Spirit is there? Like, is there evidence that the Spirit is there? I think that if we look at like the witness of the New Testament, so much of evidence of if the Spirit is there is, are there people there who have no other business why they would be together? And so if you then put that in conversation with the biblical witness of, is the Spirit present in this worshiping community? It's that there's this like hodgepodge of people, it doesn't make any sense for them to be together. And then you put that in conversation with like the reality in the United States is that Sunday morning is the most segregated hour on Sunday mornings. And that's not just a racial segregation, that's socioeconomic, that's age, that's physical ability. With the pandemic, it now has also segregated us in terms of like, are there people with like chronic health conditions versus not? And how are we like coming together? And so I think to really sit with the discomfort of even how do we think of the Spirit being present? Because sometimes I think that we get into a space that feels really good. And then we think that that's the Holy Spirit. When so much of the witness, particularly of the book of Acts, is like, are you really uncomfortable and finding out new things about the biases that you had in yourself? The Spirit's there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that really strikes me is like, this is an ongoing debate. So like, I mean, at the root of this, I mean, yes, we're talking about sort of this food and the sheet and all of that, but like underneath all of this is like, what do we do with these Gentile people who aren't circumcised, who aren't like us, who haven't fully been initiated into what we think we are? And do they belong to us or not? And so like, it's an ongoing tension. And I think next week we're going to get to that in like the Jerusalem Council and stuff. But like, it's not like Peter's experience with the Spirit was enough to convince people who hadn't experienced it yet. So Peter had to like step out on his own and say like, well, this is still for me. And to me, that's the real challenge of like, how do you, if you need to walk away from communities that are maybe holding you back from that movement of the Spirit, from being uncomfortable, from embodying that biblical example from the book of Acts of like, this is what it looks like when the Spirit shows up. And so to me, that's the thing that I sort of carry with me as I walk away from this story, is just like, the work's never really done. And, you may not have everyone on your side to step out and follow that movement of the Spirit.
Yeah, no, it makes me think of, I think earlier in the last unit, there was a conversation about like unity versus community. And uniformity, and kind of how all those things like relate to each other. And I feel like often in communities, and even in communities that are working toward diversity or working toward inclusion, we tend to look for consensus building. And I mean, that's one of the like ways that whiteness functions, is we always are trying to like smash everything down and only move if it's like majority rule, which is really just the loudest voice in the room. And so, that confidence of being able to be like, even if there isn't consensus, even if there's not a majority of people saying like, yes, this is it. Like, if we've discerned that the Spirit is present, if we've seen like God is working here, like you may be the only voice or just one of the few voices who are saying like, no, this is what God is doing, but to be confident in that and not always wait for that, for that consensus to build. But that too is a witness. That's the prophetic witness. It says like, no, this is definitely where God is at. And I have to bear witness to that.
Yeah. And it's usually in a movement towards something new. Like the vision we're getting throughout here is in it, and moving away from sort of the way things were into a new inclusiveness. Like that's where the Spirit seems to always be moving. And when you're out on that forefront, like that's when that majority rule is what sometimes slows down that movement of the Spirit, when we're doing new things and moving in new directions and being more inclusive, rather than, holding on to things. The Spirit's often not saying like, no, let's keep this restrictive and hold on to these things in this way. Anything else to add here before we wrap up?
I don't think so. I do just want to like make sure that we like just like maybe like put a little like shine on that like trajectory piece that you just brought in, right? That like, where does the Spirit move us? Because I do think that there is this narrative that I've noticed in the last few years in certain Christian circles where it's just like, oh no, like I'm saying something nobody else is saying, but this is like, but it's very regressive and it's very like, we're going to clamp down onto something that it's like, no, I think we're being invited to let that go. And so to look at through the whole Hebrew Bible, through, all of Acts, through the whole like New Testament, like what is the trajectory that the Spirit is inviting us on? And like, just because you're the only person saying it doesn't mean that's like, that is not the litmus test. Sometimes you are the only voice, but just because you're the only voice doesn't mean it's God. So I just want to like put like, if you were a book, I would be highlighting that piece of like the trajectory matters.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll wrap up here for this week. And so next week, we're actually going to get to the Jerusalem Council that we've talked about a little bit more. And I think some of those conversations on unity will come in again next week. But hopefully this week goes well for you as you prepare for this lesson here on Sunday. So thanks. We'll see you next week.